Hi guys, welcome back to my channel. In this video I will be talking about the novel Brideshead Revisited by Evelyn Waugh. So this novel is about a man named Charles Ryder who is looking back on the years that he was in college and early adulthood and his interactions with this wealthy, kind of strange Catholic family that really defined that period in his life. And his time spent at their home called Brideshead, which he literally revisits while he is serving during World War II. It's like a random note. I really love the edition that I got of this book. I got it off of thrift books, and that just happens sometimes. You just get a cool older copy. I just really love the look of this paperback. So this book deeply explores Catholicism and the effects of that on family dynamics, the ideas of what people build and pass on to future generations. And the book is obviously informed by Waugh's own experience of converting to Catholicism in adulthood. Certainly makes you wonder about kind of his aims for the book, what he wants the reader to get out of it. But, without even considering kind of the larger message, the characters in this book I found really compelling and complex, and there was a lot of very beautiful writing. So let's start with this family that Charles encounters. They're a very interesting bunch. I had in my notes once I was 100 pages into the novel that even at that point I didn't feel I had a strong grasp of any member of the family. They're kind of slippery in that way. It's very interesting. So Charles is initially brought into this family by Sebastian Flight, one of his classmates at Oxford, who is eccentric and very charming. That charm seems to be a shared trait among the family. And in those early years, in those college days, Sebastian is everything for Charles and vice versa. Their social circle shrinks to really being just one another. Sebastian is in many ways his first love and his first heartbreak. I will talk more about that relationship later. The whole family has this kind of magnetism to them, and that is certainly true for Sebastian. He has this kind of lovable innocence about him. But Sebastian is kind of haunted by his shortcomings as a Catholic and really struggles against any kind of restraint on his freedom, especially from his mother, who kind of represents Catholicism for these kids. And the result of these struggles is a dependency on alcohol that causes Sebastian to deteriorate over the course of the novel. So Sebastian has 3 siblings. The eldest son, kind of the heir apparent to everything, they call Bridie. And then his youngest sister is named Cordelia. Both of these characters are kind of true believers in Catholicism in their own ways. And he has another sister, Julia, who becomes very important to Charles in the latter half of this book. And Julia is kind of this shining star in English society when they first meet, despite the limitations in that circle of being Catholic. And she's kind of a modern woman that pushes against her faith in her own ways. She makes particularly romantic decisions without consideration of that. And later in life, she finds her own struggles with her sins as she sees them and regrets about her life. And a lot of these issues that I'm already talking about that Sebastian and Julia have in particular really come down to their parents. They have an intensely Catholic mother at home and a intensely not Catholic father who is living abroad in sin with another woman because of their mother's faith making her unable to consent to a divorce. So their father has not only rejected the Catholic faith that he adopted at the time that he married their mother, but he's come out against it quite harshly because it has made all these difficulties in his life. So really, their inheritance is religious struggle. And it's all kind of tied up in having one parent who maybe feels too involved and too controlling in their lives, and the other being too uninvolved and disconnected. So we see throughout the book Sebastian and Julia both being kind of in constant ebbs and flows in their relationships to these parents and in their closeness and distance from their faith. So let's talk about the Catholicism in this book. It's definitely one of the most important themes explored and is kind of the thing that sets this family apart. So our perspective on what it means to be Catholic is coming from an outsider. It's coming from Charles, who is not only not Catholic, but is not religious in any sense. And really, for much of the book, his viewpoint on the Catholic ideas of sin and seeking absolution is that it's a kind of madness that is tormenting these people he loves, even as it also formed a lot of the singularities that he maybe loves about them. We see a lot of anger in Charles when he comes up against their faith. And we really see how fundamentally different their experience of the world is because of the faith that they were brought up in. So this book is divided up into some sections. The title of the first section is Latin, excuse me if my pronunciation's not right, Et in Arcadia Ego, which is basically a line of the dead saying, I too am in Arcadia, in paradise. And I think for this family, the idea of death is kind of ever present. Heaven, hell, the consequences of their sins and the sins of their loved ones are always in their mind. And that kind of Catholic guilt and weight drives Sebastian in particular into self-destructive behavior. There's a part where Sebastian is talking about how much he loves his sister Julia and he feels that they're similar, and Charles says, really? You think you are similar? And Sebastian says, in looks, I mean, and the way she talks. I wouldn't love anyone with a character like mine. Sebastian seems to really believe that he is fundamentally bad. He seems incapable of loving himself. And facing his mother and his home is kind of equal to facing his sin, his faith. So we see he really has a preference for his father and rejects his childhood home, even as we see Charles kind of fall in love with Brideshead. And Charles really deeply loves Sebastian and kind of agonizes over the pain that he sees him in. And that's where, that anger first comes in, that he sees Sebastian's faith as the thing that drives him to drink. Towards the end of the book, there's this really stunning, impactful passage from Julia talking about her sin, and she describes it as like a child that she has to carry with her always, that people see her carrying this, that it's this ever-present thing that people pity her for. And it's that ever-presence that absolutely unavoidable nature of her sin that she struggles with. And it seems sometimes she's just allowing it to sink her and kind of giving up, and other times she's trying to find redemption. And that youthful anger we see in Charles, I think, develops into a kind of hopelessness. He can't save Sebastian or Julia from this thing that is inside of them. And he really doesn't see the hope or the comfort that comes with that faith until maybe the very last pages of the book. I think Waugh's thoughts on all of this are very clear based on his ending, but I'll leave that to you guys as readers to unpack. Yeah, basically, their Catholic faith is kind of an inevitable wall between them and Charles, something that he might never be able to understand. This book also has a lot to say about youth and losing youth. At the time that Charles re-encounters the house, re-encounters Brideshead, he is in his 40s, and this chapter has really firmly closed. He's very much looking back. And there's a lot about how it feels to look back on a chapter that you can't open again, about the nature of how life looked when he was young. The early days of Charles and Sebastian, they're in college and they have kind of this simulated childhood. You know, their life is kind of defined by play and mischief, despite external pressures that they should be getting serious at this point in their life. Like, everything is all about ease. But eventually and inevitably, Charles does get serious, and he finds, before he even realizes that it's happened, that he can't recapture that free joyfulness that he felt in those early days with Sebastian. There's a spirit of youth that is kind of forever lost to him. And when Sebastian loses that playfulness, he's kind of left with this erratic behavior and this deep sadness. You know, Charles, all of his experiences with this family do eventually come to an end, and you just have this sense all throughout the book that he thought he had all the time in the world. He didn't know that the ends were coming before they came. And not just for Charles, for these 4 siblings, for the Flights, we see them kind of growing out of innocence and experiencing a lot of really hard changes over the course of this book. Their lives and their homes are affected by war, the changing sort of economic status of landed families in this time period, the loss of their parents and their childhood home. We kind of have this feeling of a magic slowly seeping away. There's one part where the youngest sister, Cordelia, is talking about the chapel at their home being closed up for the last time, and the bishop kind of doing all the final ceremonies to take that chapel out of service. And she says, "I stayed there till he was gone, and then suddenly there wasn't a chapel there anymore, just an oddly decorated room. I can't tell you what it felt like." You know, there's a certain kind of magic is sort of inherent in the Catholic faith as it's represented in this book, and she really feels that magic kind of go out. And it is all tied up in the end of their childhood. And then, you know, we're wondering, how do these siblings cope with that? And really, it's through their faith. Bridie and Cordelia are pretty consistent in their faith throughout. But even the wanderers, Sebastian and Julia, do return to the faith in their own ways. So while I do think this book's ultimate conclusions about faith can be categorized as conservative or traditional, This book has definitely been featured in a lot of book bans over the years. That is because it's kind of undeniably a queer text. And I think a pretty interestingly open way for the time period. There are characters in this book that are pretty explicitly gay characters, like Charles and Sebastian's college friend, Anthony Blanche, who we see throughout the book popping up with different men in his life. And while the relationship between Charles and Sebastian is not explicitly romantic or sexual, it is very clear that they are much more to each other than friends or college buddies. The relationship is really described in the language of young love. We see Kara, who is the mistress of Sebastian's father, when she meets Sebastian and Charles, her impression of them is that this is kind of an English sort of thing that happens where two young people become very attached very young. And she equates the relationship between Sebastian and Charles to being like the relationship between Sebastian's mother and father, who got married and attached to each other too young. So, I mean, that's pretty clear. Charles himself is really despondent at the time where he is separated from Sebastian and considers Sebastian to be the first thing in his life through those years. He kind of has this chapter of his life where Sebastian is the first thing, and then later a chapter where Julia is the first thing. And the period in between those years feels like dead time to Charles. And his relationship with Julia is explicitly romantic. We never see in the books Sebastian with a woman or showing really any interest in women. So it certainly leads you to wondering if that is part of the sinfulness that is tormenting him. He believes that he was born bad. Maybe this is the expression of that, and he can't find any way to escape it. Okay, so now let's talk about kind of the patterns that have emerged in this family and the things we see that Sebastian and Julia have taken, maybe without being conscious of it. So it's interesting because these are the two characters that we see pushing back and maybe challenging and defying expectations the most, but in the end it seems they end up kind of repeating a lot of the patterns of their parents. And I don't know, maybe there's something there in Bridie and Cordelia kind of being more solid in their personalities and their sense of self than Sebastian and Julia. We see Sebastian become like his father in some ways, despite, or maybe in part because of his mother's efforts for that to not be the case. We learn that his father also had problems with drinking before he left England. And, there's a lot of talk about how him living abroad was him running away from his life. And Sebastian never seems to shake off his drinking problem, and eventually he does leave England and he never returns. Like, this is the heartbreaking thing that his mother was so afraid of. It happens. But, despite this resistance and this rejection of his life in England, we do see Sebastian come back to faith while he's living abroad in his own way. So that root of something that he was struggling with is still very much a part of him. There's this part where Julia, when she's younger in the story, explicitly says she doesn't want any more family skeletons to deal with. She doesn't want the drama and the scandal coloring her life that surrounded the separation of her parents. And she's talking about Sebastian and his problems when she's having this conversation. But she doesn't want this kind of stain on her social standing. And interestingly, she ends up kind of living in a similar arrangement. She is separated from her husband and kind of unable to move forward with another relationship despite love being there because of her Catholic faith. Not so different than her mother's position. And these kind of echoes make it feel sort of inevitable that no matter where Sebastian and Julia strayed off to, these were going to be their inevitable ends. And then coming back to their faith in particular is inevitable. Despite everything, their family and their faith remains an unbroken line. So especially towards the end of the book, there's some musing on what does our ancestry pass on to us. Charles is an artist who specializes in these architectural paintings. He's doing a lot of painting great houses before they're closed up forever. And he does a lot of musing on the Brideshead home as a place in and of itself. And the house is very interesting. It's marked by a lot of different architectural styles and changes throughout the eras as different generations have built onto it and added things. There's no sort of one single character that defines the house. And he thinks about what that would be like to have built something to pass on to the generations. And he kind of likens it to having a child, that you've brought this thing into existence and you don't know what its future will be, what its purpose will be, what kind of circumstances it will find itself in. Maybe the root of this, of having children, of building something, is kind of in a fear of death, in wanting something to live on, of being afraid of not living on. And I think we can see the connection between this kind of thinking and how Charles views the Catholic faith for much of the book as kind of these ancient ideas and rituals that have been passed on as kind of a comfort from the fear of death. That gives, sort of the comfort of forever in a world of temporaries. Charles seems almost kind of unsatisfied. He hasn't built anything. He doesn't have a family that he is part of. But maybe he can have this thing that he's been exposed to in faith. Otherwise, he just lives with his memories, those memories that are as ever present for him as Julia's concept of her sin. They're described in interestingly similar ways, I think. It's kind of one of my favorite passages from the book about memory that I think maybe I'll wrap up on. These memories, which are my life, for we possess nothing certainly except the past, were always with me. Like the pigeons of St. Mark's, they were everywhere, under my feet, singly, in pairs, in little honey-voiced congregations, nodding, strutting, weaking, rolling the tender feathers of their necks, perching sometimes, if I stood still, on my shoulder, or pecking a broken biscuit from between my lips. Until suddenly, the noon gun boomed, and in a moment, with a flutter and a sweep of wings, the pavement was bare, and the whole sky above dark with the tumult of fowl. Just a little example of some of the remarkable language you get yourself into when you're reading this novel. Okay, so this is a pretty complex novel, some complex characters. It ultimately, I think, was pretty sad, but I'd definitely be interested in hearing your perspectives. I didn't grow up Catholic or with much exposure to the Catholic faith, which this book heavily focuses on. So it would be interesting to read how somebody with that personal perspective feels about this book. Yeah, thank you for watching this video. I'll see you next time. Bye.